Welcome to the 30/30 Health Podcast. The following discussion is for education and entertainment. It is not intended to diagnose or treat disease. Please do not apply any of this information without first discussing it with your doctor. Here is your host, Guillermo Ruiz.
Hello everyone, I am super excited about today's guest. Robb Wolf is a former research biochemist, health expert, and author of 2 New York Times bestseller books, The Paleo Solution and Wired to Eat. He has been a review editor for the Journal of Nutrition and Metabolism and Journal of Evolutionary Health. He serves on the board of directors of Specialty Health Medical Clinic in Reno, Nevada, and is a consultant for the Naval Special Warfare Resilience Program. He currently lives in Nevada with his wife Nicki and daughters Zoe and Sagan. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed this show, please share it with your family and friends. Leave me a review on iTunes. That really helps this podcast. And don't forget to visit my website, 3030strong.com. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the show. So super excited to have Robb Wolf here at the podcast. Robb, how are you doing?
Good, man. Thank you for having me on. Huge honor.
Oh, 6 listeners can't be wrong,
Exactly. It worked for me.
I pulled those 6 people and I asked them, who should I have? And, Madelon wasn't available, so I called you.
And that's usually the way it plays out. Everybody wants to hear from Matt first, but he kind of pulled like a Captain, or what is it, a Dr. Manhattan deal? Like he became omnipotent and just like left the galaxy. So yeah.
He's pondering in the moon. And so,
right.
I reached out and you agreed. So, hopefully we can give some insight into this paleo movement to some people out there. So Robb, I'm a naturopathic student. I got 9 weeks to go to finish my program. And for all the naturopaths that maybe are not familiar with you, can you give us your hero story? How did you get into this mess?
Oh, man. So I've always been interested in human health, human performance. By training in the deep, dark recesses of my past, I was a biochemist, and I was doing bench level research on cancer and autoimmune disease. But right around this time, I had a serious health crisis, which related to ulcerative colitis. And it was so bad. So I walk around right now probably about 170, 175 pounds, reasonably lean and muscular for a old beat up 45-year-old guy. But at the low ebb of my ulcerative colitis, I was down to 130 pounds due to malabsorption issues. So I was really, really sick. And, when going to my docs, they didn't really have any type of a good solution for me. The best option appeared to be a bowel resection and a long, steady decline after that. But it was this idea of a paleo type diet that got on my radar, mainly because my mom also had been sick with a huge interconnected plethora of issues. They had called her a hypochondriac at various points, or at least she had called herself a hypochondriac, which we could dig a little deeper on some possibly unique thoughts I have around that terminology. But what turned out being at issue for my mother, she had about 7 different interrelated autoimmune diseases, and she appeared to be highly reactive. She was definitely celiac, but in addition to that, she appeared to be reactive to virtually all grains, all legumes, and dairy. And when she told me that, she relayed this to me over the phone, I was thinking, no grains, no legumes, no dairy. What on earth does one eat if they don't eat that? And it took really not that long. I was just thinking about this. It was about 10 minutes of noodling on it. I was like, man, okay, so grains, legumes, and dairy, that's kind of agriculture. What happened before agriculture? That was this thing called the Paleolithic. Oh yeah, there's this thing called a paleo diet that I had heard of, this kind of hunter-gatherer diet. And keep in mind, this is back in 1998. Like some of the listeners probably weren't even born at that point.
It's a fad diet.
Yeah, total fad diet and everything. And it really was a fad diet then. There were literally perhaps 200 people on the planet at that point that knew what the heck this thing was. So that was really the genesis of this whole thing, was a personal discovery and trying to to fix my own health issues. And I had the good fortune to just kind of be at a lot of the right places at the right time. Was able to work with a lot of people. I co-founded the first and fourth CrossFit affiliate gyms in the world and worked for CrossFit Inc. for a long time and was kind of their nutrition guy. And that just provided a remarkable laboratory to work with people and, play around with all these different variables and see where the theory met reality.
I remember, a couple of things that I want to go through that little, your introduction. I remember when you said that you founded the first CrossFit. There's a couple of videos on YouTube, and I'll put them on the notes, and they're pretty hilarious and pretty awesome. Second, so my mom has been suffering with a bunch of thyroid issues since she was 19, okay? I discovered this paleo diet around 10 years after you, 2008, 2009. And I've been like a prophet, just talking about paleo, telling my mom, don't eat grains. Yesterday, I get a text. She got diagnosed with a celiac, with a wheat allergy.
Oh, interesting. Interesting.
Probably one of the greatest days of my life. but it, sometimes when it comes to family, sometimes if you're trying to convince your parents, it really has to, they remember you when they were changing your diapers. So they're not going to listen to you. It almost has to come from a second person or a third person, and maybe they got to have an MD behind their names in order for it to sink in. But man, I was like doing cartwheels. But you touched on hypochondria. What's hypochondria?
So hypochondria, I think everybody is at least on a instinctual level. It's funny, I was going to say on a gut level. An instinctual level, they understand what hypochondria is supposed to mean, which is you have somebody who's always sick, and the implication there is they just think they are sick. And, it's just one thing after another. And what's interesting in this whole story is that when you break down kind of the Latin roots of hypochondria, hypo means below, chondria means joint or cartilage, but it also means ribs. And so when you really break hypochondria down to its essence, it's the area below the ribs, which is the gut. And so I'm just fascinated by this. I still haven't really been able to dig up where this notion that the malingering patient that has a million things going on, this has become a very negative connotation. They're saying that all the issues are in your head and everything, but there's also this line out of the beginning of modern Western medicine, which is this idea that all disease begins in the gut. So I'm wondering if this term hypochondria was applied early on as kind of actually a far more accurate catch-all term for the plethora of issues that people can suffer from that doesn't fall into one specific category or, isn't easily diagnosed. But, on some instinctual level, these folks knew that it was occurring at the gut. But then somewhere along the line, this got turned into a, kind of a maligning type of term, or maybe it was a maligning term right from the beginning, but inadvertently, they were actually onto a more accurate description of what was going on than what they possibly knew.
Now, and I think a paleo diet, your book, The Paleo Solution, probably I've bought so many books for my friends. That's the number one book that I recommend for patients up until you wrote this new book, Wired to Eat. What have you been doing in between the two books? You were very active on your podcast, and but how did you get into this Wired to Eat form of regulation of appetite and diet?
Oh man, I really, at the end of the Paleo Solution, when that was done, this is how naive I am. I sent that thing to the publisher, and I looked at Nicki, and I'm like, okay, our job's done. Like, medicine is going to change. This is going to, like, we need to go farm coconuts or something, because I just put myself out of work, basically. And
you wrote a book for the gut.
Well, it was effectively for the gut and, all of these diseases of modernity. And it's been really helpful. Arguably my book maybe kind of cracked open the paleo diet genre, which now has really gone far beyond just this paleo diet concept. You know, Whole30 is a derivative of this, but they've got a whole branded, you know, less controversial kind of branding around it. It's still essentially the same methodology, but you know, the stuff has grown like crazy. The Cleveland Clinic is now certifying its doctors in functional medicine, which usually one of the foundational elements of that is you know, kind of a paleo diet evolutionary medicine template. You've got the Kresser Institute doing amazing work. You've got people like yourself who are going through naturopathy school, which the naturopathy thing has always been really fascinating to me, that it went so deep into the vegetarian vegan kind of framework. Whereas if the naturopaths had been able to bypass that dead end and they had really stepped back and said, okay, so we're trying to look at nature for information about how to inform our medical treatments and evolutionary biology, hunter-gatherers, man, they would have really had something going on there. And you know, slowly that type of stuff is changing. But
well, I'm gonna do a little preview right now for my listeners. My school will have a booth at Paleo FX, so I think we're changing the tides.
Wow!
Man. Yeah, we're changing the tides. Yeah.
Holy smokes! Who would have thought? Well, I mean, you know, it's kind of like competing operating systems. Like at some point, you kind of figure out that probably being on an Apple is a little bit better than PC. So, but as a complete aside, you know, I really didn't think I was going to do another health-related book. Like I had some ideas around like a longevity and anti-aging book and some different things like that, but I felt like it'd be quite a bit different. But I have the good fortune to be on several different research groups, and I get research papers all the time, and you and I share these back and forth, you know, fairly frequently. And just one day, about three and a half years ago, I got this paper on human brain evolution, and one of the taglines was the omnivore's real dilemma. And this ended up being the inspiration for my Paleo FX talk 3 years ago, I think now. And what was interesting is it had a ton of like quote paleo stuff in it. You know, it was lots of evolutionary biology, but it couched this whole thing from the terms of the neuroregulation of appetite. And that is an extension of this process called optimum foraging strategy, which is this basic kind of economics or accounting story, which is that any organism that moves to get its food, you know, that's not a plant and is collecting photosynthetic energy, if it's moving around to get its dinner to some degree, it needs to get more out of its environment than what it expends obtaining that food. But otherwise, it will die at some point. And people are so divorced from this reality throughout most of the developed world that, you know, we don't remember that eating is a survival story. Breathing is a survival story. Reproduction is a survival story. And so these are really, you know, deeply woven you know, ancient areas of our DNA, ancient areas of our brain that regulate all this stuff. And the crux of this paper was just making the case that if you live in this modern, industrialized, hyperpalatable food world, and you're not fat, sick, diabetic, and broken, that in a way, from an evolutionary biology standpoint, you're screwing up. Like you should be eating everything that's not nailed down and then laying down and taking a rest. And so, you know, what it did for me, I looked at that and I'm like, oh, it's not your fault. Like if you, and that was actually the working title of the book for a long time, which it's not your fault. And I think it's still either chapter 1 or chapter 2 or something like that within the book. So that was something that I was like, man, that's really interesting. You know, here's a way to cover this evolutionary medicine material, but start it from this perspective that's really quite mechanistic. You know, we're looking at the neuroregulation of appetite, which is a devilishly complex process. It's sleep, photoperiod, stress, gut microbiome, digestion, the food itself. All these things factor into the neuroregulation of appetite, and they all have positive and negative feedback loops that can make that story work for us or against us. But as mechanistic as that story is, there's this also really beautiful empathic element to it, which is, again, this notion that, hey, it's not your fault. Like if you find that living in the modern world is challenging with regards to, you know, not eating the whole bag of sea salt and vinegar potato chips, which it would be my personal favorite in that's not surprising. That's not weird. You're not broken. You're not damaged. But at the same time, I'm definitely not in the kind of fat acceptance camp either. I mean, if that's where you want to be, that's fine. But there's a reality that people who are overweight or experiencing metabolic issues, like they're going to have a less healthy, less enjoyable life, period. And there are some people that want to accept that, and there are other people that don't want to accept that, but they're trapped in this quagmire of emotions and guilt and this perspective. I was like, man, this could really liberate people. And so I started tinkering with it. I'm on the board of directors of a medical clinic here in Reno, and I started chatting with some people and kind of framing this stuff from this neuroregulation of appetite perspective, and it's not your fault, and we're in this together. And it was really powerful, but it wasn't a book yet. And the other piece that kind of fell into place for me, where I felt like that was a good beginning, but we needed some endpoints, some kind of different methodology for looking at all this, and that came in the form of a paper that came out of the Weizmann Institute in Israel about 2 years ago now, 2.5 years ago. And it was this deep dive into personalized nutrition. And in the long and short of that is that they fed people different food and carbohydrate combinations. They were tracking their blood glucose the whole time with continuous blood glucose monitors. They did a full gut microbiome sequencing and genetic sequencing. And, they found an algorithm where they felt like there was some kind of predictive value in, if you have these genetics and this gut microbiome flora, then you should probably eat these types of foods. But the real takeaway at the 30,000 foot level was that there is massive differences from one person to another with regards to how they respond to food. One person would eat a bowl of rice and have beautiful blood glucose response. Another person would eat the same 50-gram bowl of rice and they would have near diabetic blood glucose levels. And when I saw that, I was like, that's what we're missing. We need to be able to diffuse the emotional content that people have around diet and lifestyle change. We need to set them up for success. And then we need a process where we can triage them, get them into a couple of different buckets based off of their insulin sensitivity, insulin resistance. And I have a pretty slick process in the book where we start people at a empirical kind of observational level, subjective elements like, how do you feel between meals? How long can you go without eating and not, suffer like catastrophic, cognitive and physical failure? And then we get more granular and specific by looking at some blood work like A1C, fasting glucose, LPIR score, which is a lipoprotein insulin resistance score. This thing is really nicely tuned for ferreting out insulin resistant issues. And with this material, we can then embark on a 30-day reset, which is basically a paleo type diet. And then after this reset, which hopefully reestablishes normal gut flora, helps us get moving in a good direction with regards to the neuroregulation of appetite, then I like to pressure test the system. And we use this thing called the 7-day carb test to do that. And we take a 50-gram effective carbohydrate dose from a variety of foods. You get to pick the foods. I still hump people's knee to stay gluten-free, but, that's kind of up to you. But people eat these, these meals. Ideally, it's breakfast or the first meal of the day. 2 hours postprandial, we take a blood glucose test. If the blood sugars are below a certain level, then we're pretty good to go on that. If it's above that level, then we consider whether or not the food or the amount of that specific food is questionable or problematic, and then we have some kind of mitigating strategies to go from there. But that's kind of the how, the why, the reason, the methodology, all wrapped up into one incredibly long, rambling answer.
Well, with the Weizmann Institute, the personalized nutrition, I actually used that study to kind of shape. I was teaching a community class called Demystifying the Paleo Diet, because even a year ago, we were still talking about macronutrients as being, is the paleo diet a low carb diet? And you still hear that, and like I want to scream it out of the Grand Canyon. It's not. It's macronutrient agnostic, and I used that paper to actually map out my class. And then I got a hold of like the president of the school, like start showing up to the classes, and we've been talking about this nutrition and little by little, hopefully we can reach more and more people and really expand on this. But, I'd like to read an excerpt of the book and then discuss a little bit about it, because I really want to get into the nitty gritty of some of the obstacles to cure, the obstacles to health. Several years ago, I was hired to manage the food and physical training of a highly successful businessman. Let's call him Dan. Dan's incredible intellect and near fanatical work ethic have produced products from which all of us have benefited. This guy is literally a world mover, and he has also been seriously overweight most of his life. Dan's weight was reaching a breaking point. After he'd crush a gallon or two of ice cream, he would suffer vision loss and a number of other problems. He was likely diabetic, but unwilling to go to a doctor lest he be forced to change what he was doing. We were introduced via mutual acquaintances, and he quizzed me on what my plan would be for him, all while working his way through 2 half-gallons of ice cream. I think he did this to gauge my reaction, to see if he could get a rise out of me. But I'm pretty zen about this stuff. I'll do just about anything to help someone who is motivated to do so, but I can also border on callousness if the person is hell-bent on self-destruction. Whatever the case, I impressed Dan enough that he hired me to work with him 24/7 for 6 months. I'd handle his food and physical training and would do my best to get him to sleep more than 4 hours per night. The game was on. I cleaned out the pantry, provided a meal plan for the chefs who prepared the meals for Dan's family, and set up a schedule to meet Dan for physical training. All seemed to be progressing fine, until one evening when I was walking through the house and smelled what could only be donuts. I knocked on Dan's office door, and sure enough, he was working his way through a bag of donuts. He was evasive about where the food had come from, but with a little digging, I found that Dan had paid some of his house staff to drive to the donut shop at a specific time, throw the bag of donuts over the security fence ringing his property. On the inside of the fence was another staff person who was waiting to intercept the flying bag of fried dough. Once acquired, they delivered the goods to Dan. Not one to be outdone, I went to Dan's wife and explained the situation and said, I need a budget for a counter-insurgency campaign. I now had a pool of money to pay off the staff not to do Dan's bidding with regards to hooking him up with junk food. This worked for a few days, until Dan got wise to our work and simply threatened to fire anyone unwilling to follow through his request. I confronted Dan about this, and he just smirked. It's not my job to make your job easy. He was enjoying this and rather liked the game of spy versus spy. I was a bit stumped about why this guy was making it so hard for me to help him not to eat himself to death. In addition to the tactics I just described, Dan would routinely moralize his food failures and turn these minor deviations into an excuse for multi-day benders. I noodled on what the hell was going on and finally had what proved to be an important insight. None of this had to do with food. Food was a symptom, not the problem. I noticed a pattern. Dan was emotionally distant from everyone, including his wife. The only people he really had no barriers against were his kids. In a flash of insight, I knew exactly what was up, and I had a plan for how to address it. The following day, Dan and I were talking, and I told him how incredibly grateful I was for the opportunity to work with him. I was getting paid very well, and this money was helping my wife and I get a number of projects off the ground much faster than we would have been able to do otherwise. I was sincere in this feeling, but was also softening him up to get through his nearly impregnable barrier. I then said something like this: I'll be able to help so many people as a consequence of my work with you, but I have to admit to feeling a sense of failure. I have not really been able to help you. This caught Dan off guard, and in a very uncharacteristic moment, he was at a loss for words. I then asked him, Dan, who didn't love you? The color drained out of his face, and he replied with a barely audible, what? I repeated the question, and he became really agitated, angry, and flustered. He yelled at me in about 6 different languages. He was mad and scared. I asked the question again, Dan, who didn't love you? This has nothing to do with food. You know it, and I know it. So, Rob, what about the emotional aspect of food? You hear it over and over. We need to have a good relationship with food. What is that? What does that even mean?
Guillermo, you just had to take it there, didn't you? Didn't you? You had to ask that question. Yeah, I mean, I have a remarkable amount of time devoted in the book talking about this, and it's a reasonably controversial topic in that people get really, really angry with me on this topic. in working with people. So I arrived at this stuff, again, kind of empirically, and I just have to throw a caveat out, or maybe a little bit of a backstory disclaimer. A lot of what I talk about in Wired to Eat is pretty emotional, pretty touchy-feely, and even this point about, I make the case that we don't need a healthy relationship with food, that's a misplaced focus, and I'll dig into that a little bit more in a minute. But it's I have the emotional acuity of a turnip. Like I literally I'm like a Vulcan. Like I'm just super logical. I love my family, but the rest of the world, I'm just super logical, kind of, flat emotional affect. And so you may be wondering, it's weird, or it's interesting to me that I've arrived at putting so much focus on the emotional side of this. And I would say that this is one of the big differences between my current book and the previous book. Is the previous book had phenomenal mechanistic processes and a tiny little, dusting of kind of emotional treatment. Like I talked about stress and, do you own your stuff, or does your stuff own you? I had some observations like that. But this other book, really, I mean, it's kind of starting from this premise of,
it's
not your fault. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the core piece there. So this, when in working with people from the gym to the medical clinic to quite a number of locations, if I interacted with someone and in conversation or in the process of working with them, this notion that they were seeking a healthy relationship with food, if that popped up, I knew that we were in trouble, and we were in desperate trouble. Because the process of trying to find a healthy relationship with food is like trying to calculate the final decimal point of pi. It never happens. You just keep going and going and going. And what I figured out was that clearly food was a factor here, but what had happened is that this individual had suffered some sort of a trauma, some sort of a hurt and abandonment, it inevitably related to some sort of relationship deal, whether with a parent or significant other, childhood friends. I mean, the list was almost infinite, but there was some sort of a hurt there. And food was used as a palliative methodology, a way of making oneself feel better, where the individual had complete control, and it developed into kind of a problem. But the thing about it was that focusing on the food was chasing a symptom. It was never going to get the person to the point where they actually address the underlying issue. And the book excerpt that you pulled from, we have a great example of that. So that's kind of my piece with the whole, do you need a healthy relationship with food? My argument is that we eat food, we have responses to our food, but that's it. And this notion that we need a healthy relationship with it is as misplaced as we need a healthy relationship with our car or our chair, and some people do have weird relationships with their car, and those people are nuts. Yeah, and those people are kind of certifiably nuts, and they've got something, think about somebody that they put more, and we probably all know someone like this. They care more about their car than they do their spouse or their kids, or like it's a close thing going on there. What's going on with that person? There's some emotional break in that individual that usually then forces them to spend lots of money on super cool cars, so that it props up some damaged element of their ego. But that that process is unhealthy, because there's a anthropomorphizing of it essentially an inanimate object, and making it have more importance than the relationships that we have, the life that we live. And it's really similar to the food story.
In so many levels, I remember when you pass that honeymoon paleo where you're telling everyone about the paleo diet, and then you go into this next step that people come up to you and they say to you, hey, I want to lose weight, can you help me? And then you lay it out in front of them, and they go, well, I can't do that. And I'm to the point that I was like, okay, I'll look for people that actually want to help themselves, which is not the best way of approaching something, but I think there's enough sick people out there that are looking for help, that I'm not going to get into arguments on Facebook over veganism or over keto or over, I want this podcast and my work to be a vehicle to help people, but we're leaving a whole subset of people that don't have a good relationship with food. And I think your book makes such a good argument, and maybe people that are reading that book are going to introspectively change what the relationship with food. And you see that with economics, and you see that with television and phones. But it was just so powerful to read that chapter of the book, because it really sheds a light at a big problem that we have in our society.
Oh, thank you. I've had some really nice feedback so far from people who had historically had what they would call disordered or binge eating, and I haven't gotten real deep into what the specifics are. So these are very 30,000 foot level relations that are going back and forth on like social media and whatnot. But the story that's been articulated is, okay, Rob, for 25 years, I've had disordered eating. I tend to binge eat. I would feel horrible. I would beat myself up. I would, feel like a failure. And then after reading the book and really, kind of meditating on what the implications were there, it's like, oh, it's reasonable and normal that I want to eat everything that's not nailed down, and there's nothing wrong with me in that regard. I need to figure out strategies for dealing with that. But at least at some level, I'm no longer beating myself up for the desire to do this. And with that, diffusing of the guilt, all of a sudden these folks are able to start making, qualitative incremental changes that appear to be sticking over the long haul. So, I mean, it's been kind of cool because the reality is that it's helping people, and folks are getting really good benefit from this process.
So let's talk about some actionable things. Okay, I know my number one listener is listening, riding a tractor right now. What can he start doing right now in order to, he wants to change his life. He knows that he needs to make a change. Where would you start?
Funny enough, even though we've talked a ton about food, within the book, I break things down into what I call the 4 pillars of health. And the first pillar is sleep and photoperiod. And photoperiod is how much light we are exposed to, both during the day and more in the evening or the night. And those two are just inseparable. The amount of light that we get exposed to drives our circadian rhythm, drives our wake-sleep cycle. So those two are inseparable. And then we have food, then we have exercise, then we have community. All of them are super important. But I would argue that the sleep and photoperiod piece is the most important factor in our health. You can eat horribly for decades before it's going to kill you. If you really disorder your sleep in a significant way, you've got weeks, possibly months before you're going to expire, or at least wish that you were going to expire, because it will crush you so quickly. So the greatest return on investment that I've ever seen with any of this stuff, if somebody's like, man, I'm just not going to change my diet, like I like what I'm doing, but if there was one thing that they could do that would really improve things, it's pay more attention to sleep. And that process is really simple. When the sun goes down, you dim the lights in your house. You put on some blue blockers. You stay off of, computers and tablets. If you have to use those things, then use some of the programs that pull the blue wavelengths of light out so that we don't suppress melatonin production. There's some really, simple mitigative strategies that you can use that will help you get in bed earlier and have more effective sleep. And then, another really simple piece to that is completely black out your sleep environment, whether that's a closet or a bedroom. Make it like a Kentucky trailer park with a bunch of aluminum foil on the windows, make it pitch black. And these are some, for a cheap pair of blue blockers, it's $10 off of Amazon.com. For a roll of aluminum foil, it's $3, so for less than $20, you could have an elite level sleep lab in your own home that's going to help you get the best restoration, best recovery. Sleep is the most potent anabolic agent. So if you want to be a better athlete, it's going to promote that better than just about anything else you could do. If you want better cognition because you're a corporate exec or a student, there's no better return on investment. And if you want to forestall aging, sleeping is about the best thing you could possibly do again. So funny enough, even though, we talk a ton about food in the book and all this nutritional stuff, I would argue that sleep and photo period is the place to start for everybody. And then, if you want to start pulling some other levers, then we can look at stuff like, are you drinking liquid calories in the form of like soda or sugary coffee drinks and stuff like that? And if we just ditched a few things like that, and instead of every single meal being made up of processed carbohydrates, maybe one meal in 10 has some processed carbohydrates in it, which would be about every 3 days. These are really simple moves that we can make that would just have profound, benefits for our health and our longevity and just our quality of life.
And you detail all of those processes in your Wired to Eat book. And whenever I give someone your book, Paleo Solution, one of the things that they would come back and tell me was like, I really like that book. And the reason I like that book is because it has shopping guides. And there's two types of people. There's people that want everything spoon-fed and they can plan it ahead of time. And then but there's this other subset of people that it might be actually smaller, that want to know the biochemistry and they want to know the reason of why am I cutting this, and they want to get really granular and really know the whys of everything. But I think the reason why that first book was so successful is because it was pretty, you hand it out, you do it for 30 days, and that's it. And you did the same with Wired to Eat. You can, if you are a person that just wants actionable things, you can just go to the actionable section of the book and go ahead and implement these changes.
Right. Yeah, I do make it a little bit of a choose your own adventure, where if you're like, okay, I'm sold, just let me start, then we'll let you jump in and do it. My only caveat with that is if you jump right into things, you don't get to ask any questions. You just follow exactly what the the Arthur Murray dance steps are, and you follow that to a T, because that the book's almost 400 pages, and I would have loved for it to be shorter. Trust me, like every 10,000 pages or words of grind is not a super fun process at times, but I had to take long enough to answer enough of the questions that inevitably come up, so that people don't just get bogged down constantly with all that stuff.
Now, why do you think when people think about weight loss or getting back into health, the first thought is exercise, and then maybe nutrition, and you hear it all over and over? Oh, the reason I run is so I can have a beer.
Right. Well, I mean, there is a reality that exercise and nobody likes exercising. Everybody likes movement. So maybe we'll call it movement. But this just increasing the caloric expenditure can certainly help under many circumstances. And there's lots of nice benefits to being in good physical condition, having some basic strength, having some cardiovascular capacity, and mobility. Like you're set up to live a much more varied and I think enjoyable life in that regard. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting that, when you look at the literature, good research, exercise isn't really all that great at helping people lose body fat in general. And most diets fail too. Like that's one of the opening salvos of my book. I say you hold in your hands a nutrition book or a diet book, and if you were smart, you would probably run screaming away from it, because chances are it's going to fail, if we just look critically at the statistics around this. But to it's without a doubt at this point, the nutrition lever is one of the most, again, sleep is such a big factor. And I don't even think that we've investigated this stuff enough, but I don't know how to answer the question of why do people look towards exercise, other than you maybe do, at least in some cases, you get some good feelings from exercise. So there's maybe an argument that there's a little bit of a dopamine release and you feel good from that. And if there's this notion in your head that, okay, if I exercise, then I still get to have my cocaine-like foods, then you get the dopamine release from that. And so, you're not really giving, in that situation, you're adding something to the program instead of deleting it. And this is an interesting behavior change story where, you start trying to push out bad behaviors or bad elements by introducing more stuff. And so you actually, it's kind of trying to occupy that space in some way. So that would be my thought, is that, some people do end up enjoying the exercise process. It makes them feel better. And then they get to still have their food, and they, effectively they haven't really changed anything other than adding something. People get really cranky about deleting things out of their life, interestingly, but there's less of a perceived threat when you're just adding something else.
The same with, with your diet. The first thing you should do is eliminate from your pantry and your refrigerator as many things as possible that are not going to be congruent with your lifestyle.
Exactly.
And that's, if it's not at home, you're not going to eat it.
Well, here's a great, some people kind of throw their hands up in alarm about that sometimes, particularly if they have children in the house. But here's an interesting study that was done, and I believe it was Gretchen Rubin that related this first. But they had office workers were provided M&Ms, peanut M&Ms no less, like the most cocaine of the M&Ms. And the M&Ms were to be located in one of three different locations. First location is on the desktop in a bowl immediately within arm's reach. Second location is in a drawer at the desk, but you basically have to scoot the chair out, open the drawer, grab a handful, close the drawer, scoot the chair back in to be able to get to it. Third location is that all the M&Ms are going to be kept on the opposite side of the office. Everybody knows where they are, and everybody is encouraged to tease one another as they go back to get the M&Ms. Okay, so just the act of moving the M&Ms from the top of the desk to in the drawer dropped consumption by half. Just that tiny little speed bump ended up reducing the consumption by half. And then when you looked at the consumption, when you had to walk down the hallway and have some like social pressure around it, it dropped the consumption almost to zero. And so if you think about that, like this proximity story is incredibly important, both on all levels of success. We need to have good food options immediately at hand to be able, and sometimes that may mean getting something like a frozen or prepared meal that is good composition, but you can pop it on the stovetop, put it in a microwave or what have you, if you're really in a, kind of a desperate situation. And then the flip side of that, we don't sit in bed dreaming about pork loin and broccoli. We think about the Little Debbie snack cakes and ice cream and again, sea salt and vinegar potato chips. So if we have that stuff in the house, it's almost a guarantee that we're gonna be rooting through it at some point. And I don't advocate that we never have that stuff in general. Again, like I'm kind of like the kind of lunatic guy recommending that folks remain more or less gluten-free, but I really like sea salt and vinegar potato chips. That should be clear by now. I think I've mentioned it 16 times. So we just had Easter Sunday. We had a bunch of people over. I went and got some of the Justin's, like, super awesome potato chips. Or it's not Justin's, it's Honest something. Oh man, I forget the name. I can totally see the bag. But I got a couple of bags of that, put them in bowls, and I knew that we were going to have 15 people over at the house. And I had some of it. Everybody else had some of it. It was gone. I didn't have 3 bags of this stuff sitting around in the pantry that at 11 o'clock at night, I would wake up and go out there and want to eat it. And so I just figure out mitigating strategies like that, where if there's something that I really like and it's kind of a cool thing to kick your heels up and have a little, something different, then that's fine. But I just can't have bags of that stuff sitting in the pantry or I will eat it all.
Well, and most importantly, okay, is that the scientists are winning. They are making the super palatable foods in order for us to eat them. That's the whole point of adding salt and vinegar to potato chips.
What's the Lay's potato chip tagline?
Bet you can eat just one.
Bet you can't eat just one, and I will take that bet all day long. There have been tens of millions of dollars have been spent on not just like food engineering, but actually studying evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology. Unilever, which is one of the largest processed food manufacturers in the world, and they're also deep into the pharmaceutical scene, In 2003, they spent $50 million in an initiative to start studying evolutionary medicine. And they didn't do it specific. Like, they may be looking at some pharmaceutical tracks with it, but part of the track that they're doing is figuring out how to really understand our evolutionary wiring to make stuff like potato chips more addictive, more habituating. And so the people who are profiteering from our suffering, arguably, they totally get this evolutionary medicine, paleo diet kind of concept, but they're using it in a way that really is exploiting us. Whereas the bulk of our gatekeepers, most of the medical establishment, particularly the dietitians, they are still in denial that there's anything to learn from this paleo diet evolutionary medicine construct. And so the gatekeepers are ignorant of this topic entirely and giving us horrible advice. The people who are creating addictive, habituating foods totally get it and are totally exploiting it day in and day out. And so, this is another layer to this story where, people may cross their arms and kind of feel smug. They're like, this stuff, I don't know, there's not much science behind it. But if you do a little digging on where the food manufacturers, even social media outlets like Facebook and Twitter, they really study this neurophysiology, neurochemistry, addictive process to make social media more addictive.
So what happens is that you hear this message, oh, you need to eat less calories. You need to eat less calories. So you go to your supermarket and you buy a 500 calorie lean cuisine with hyper palatable food. So then you buy enough lunches, and now because your brain is wired to eat and you don't get any satiety from this lean cuisine super hyper palatable food, now you'll be looking for the M&Ms.
Right.
So your book is giving us an insight into how to eat less calories that are satiating.
That's really the trick, is how do we get people to spontaneously reduce caloric intake? And, you don't have to put two toes into the internet, pissing matches before you get folks on the high carb camp and the low carb camp and all this stuff. And the reality is all of it only has relevance in a free living population that has access to effectively infinite food options. What are we going to do both on an intellectual level and also on kind of a coaching and support level to help people navigate? And we have all these pissing matches again about like, well, it's just about calories, so just eat less and move more. Well, okay, not all calories register the same in the brain. The fundamental wiring that we have is to eat more, move less. So you're telling us to do something that is as biologically uninstinctual as telling someone to continue holding their breath when they've been underwater for 5 minutes and they're about ready to pass out and drown. I mean, it is absolutely ridiculous. And people will get spun up about that, but let's just look at disease rates. Is morbidity and mortality associated with diabetes and whatnot getting better or worse? It's getting worse, and we spend more money on it than we've ever spent in history. We know more about these disease processes than ever in history, but our rates of these things keep getting worse. If the analogy was applied to our cell phones, we would basically have the equivalent of a rotary dial phone in our pockets now, instead of the amazing little bits of technology that we have. We are just telling people in general the wrong stuff.
But that rotary phone would be connected to fiber.
Exactly.
So you would be like, oh, we have this technology to move gobs and gobs of information but you gotta use this rotary phone.
Right. Yeah, there's no touch screen interface, and so the ability to move that information is worthless effectively. And I mean that,
And now, in after reading your book, and I've been having this hunch about writing this post, and I'm gonna get a lot of people pissed off, but I want to write a blog post, and it's gonna be in the coming days about paleo foods. So sure, they are less inflammatory, but you are bypassing satiety, you are increasing palatability, and that's how people end up failing at paleo. And then you'll hear people tell you, I tried paleo, it didn't work for me. And I look at them with my, blank stare and I go, you are a human being from planet Earth. Your physiology indicates that this diet should have worked. You failed. And it's such a bad message, and I need to change the way I approach this. But I'm tired of seeing paleo cookies, paleo cupcakes, paleo pizza, because we're just using that to feed our addiction.
Yeah, and I mean, even back in 2001, when Loren Cordain wrote his first book, The Paleo Diet, this was before there was Pinterest or anything, I mean, there was none of this stuff on the interwebs, but even at that very nascent period in time, there were folks tinkering with kind of like paleo desserts and stuff like that. And again, there was nothing like what we can find today, but he made the point that although nuts are probably okay, dates are probably okay, if you stick nuts and dates together, cook them in a certain way, add some cacao and a little bit of coconut sugar and maybe some coconut butter to hold the whole thing together, you now have an incredibly tasty, calorically dense food that although built from technically paleo type food sources, it's been put together in a way that, if you're going to have it, maybe it's like once a month or something. It's not every single day.
Cake on your birthday.
Cake on your birthday, that's reasonable, but cake every day after lunch and dinner, probably not reasonable.
It gets so big, because you discover this way of eating, you're losing weight, you're feeling better, and then you start you remember all these foods that you used to have as a child, or you used to have as growing up, and you remember that dopamine connection of happiness, and eating a cupcake is so strong. And now I get in a lot of trouble because I don't have a sweet tooth, so it's very easy for me to say I don't need a cupcake. But there are people out there that they do have this really strong sweet tooth. In your with your clients, how do you help your clients move away from having this urge to just eat sugar?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, and depending on where we pick the person up, so in my first book, there was a guy in there, I think I called him Jorge, but he was actually our attorney at the time. Really an amazing guy. And, but he's 5'9". He showed up in our gym at 420 pounds. And, he had not drank plain, unsweetened, unflavored water, in his estimation, for more than 15 years. And I mean, this guy was so habituated to eating hyper palatable foods that he would literally, like, he ended up in the hospital one time from dehydration because he was traveling, and like, just through whatever set of circumstances, he wasn't able to get like a soda, a fruit juice sweetened water or something like that. So he just refused to drink water. For him, the way he described it, it would be like most people thinking about drinking water out of a flushed toilet. Like, he had that level of disdain about this. And so, holy smokes, man, like, that was just kind of an incremental process with him. So we took him from sugar sweetened sodas to diet sodas, and then we switched from the aspartame type diet sodas to like the stevia sweetened type stuff, and then we shifted him eventually from stevia sweetened to just like a spritz of lime or raspberry, basically like a slightly juice infused but really no caloric content, but also no sweetener. And that was probably a year-long process to get him to that. I mean, it was no freaking joke. And God has never made someone more adept at arguing than this guy. I mean,
his lawyer.
He was just born for this stuff, and he argued about everything. But we got him to shift on that. He was also the person that I mentioned in the first book, where they just weren't really losing much weight, and they're making a little progress, but not great. And I'm like, okay, write down what you're eating. And so there was an afternoon snack of nuts. And I was like, nuts? How many nuts are you eating? And he's like, oh, one of the Costco containers of nuts, because Loren Cordain says that you can eat unlimited amounts of paleo foods and you're still going to lose weight. And so I was like, okay, here's what we need to do. We need, Ziploc bag, 2 ounces of nuts. That's your limit for the day. And once we did, because that Costco container of almonds was 3,500 calories alone. and he was still losing weight, and he still had breakfast, lunch, and dinner on top of that. So, I mean, but it just wasn't super impressive weight loss. But the long and short of all that is we got this guy from over 400 pounds down to about 190 pounds, strong, fit, and he eats in a way that is profoundly different from what he started with. And we had to do some really incremental work with him. And I'll be honest, I hate the incremental work. Like, I'm more of a jump in with both feet, sink or swim, because, I'm lazy. It's just a lot less work than hand holding and stewarding people through that whole process. But there's a reality, I make so many cases throughout the book, the right tool for the right situation. And, the right tool for many people is an incremental process. The notion of throwing them straight into a 30-day reset or a Whole30 or something like that is just going to be too much. And so we have to figure out, okay, what's the first thing we're going to cover? Okay, we'll pick two things, a lifestyle and a diet thing. Lifestyle, we're going to practice our sleep hygiene. Here's some simple steps with that. And then on the food side, we're going to have no liquid calories. We'll start with that. And the no liquid calories initially may mean that they're doing diet soda instead of regular soda. And then we'll try to move things forward from there.
Yeah, I think you've been pretty consistent throughout the years in, giving it the good old try. But if you are not receiving the results that you were expecting, go hire a personal trainer. Go see a practitioner. Some of this stuff, it's really profound, and you really need to be helped. And I think you've been pretty consistent with that message.
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
We're getting a little long. I just have one more question for you.
Sure.
Why do you think this movement attracts so many entrepreneurs?
That's a really interesting question. So there's a guy in my Facebook feed, super sharp dude. He goes by a pseudonym, so it's not even worth throwing it out there, but he's a really smart dude. And he made an observation that kind of struck me, which was, so if you look at kind of the political spectrum, you got kind of folks on the right, more on the left. You've got these libertarians that are usually kind of socially liberal but fiscally conservative. And I would say that these are the tiny subfraction of people that are actually looking at the world through reality. But that aside, just ride with me if folks are wanting to hate me on this. But he made an interesting argument, which was that a ketogenic diet was the libertarian way of eating because it effectively liberates you from food. And that was really interesting. Now, clearly, you still have to eat at some point. You're not fully, if you want to be fully liberated from food, be a breatharian and you'll die. And
there's a couple at the school.
Yeah, there's a few floating around. They don't last that long typically, either in their breatharian ways or just life. But it was interesting. It was really interesting. And so, a metabolically broken sugar burner who is, basically they approach food like an emphysemic approaches an oxygen bottle. They need a constant update and a constant dose to keep them moving along. They are completely a slave to that process. Whereas someone, whether it's kind of a paleo type diet or a ketogenic type diet, you really are remarkably liberated from the food process because you could go hours or days without eating. And it might kind of suck, but it's not going to cripple you the way that it will cripple someone that is really metabolically broken. And, many people who head into entrepreneurship elements, they tend to have some of these kind of market-driven libertarian type leanings. Otherwise they really wouldn't go into entrepreneurship. They would try to get a government job or something like that, not to say that government jobs are terrible, but there's different risk tolerances and stuff like that. And so different personality types will seek things out. So I do find it interesting that there's some overlap there. And, even within Silicon Valley, you see these reports, like, what are the things that these, high-powered execs are theoretically doing? Some of them are vegan and they play around with that. A ton of them play around with this intermittent fasting, paleo, keto type of thing because they're on point. Their cognition is great. They don't get sick as often. There's like all these upsides. And also they discover, wow, I don't need to eat all the time. Like I'll eat once, maybe twice a day. And so I'm more productive. My energy's good. I don't have, slumps in the afternoon where I need like a venti coffee and a line of cocaine to keep going. And so I think it's interesting that we see people at the really outer edges of human performance in the business world. There's kind of in statistics, there's what's called an attractor, which is basically it's like a data point or a phenomena that tends to pull everything towards it. And, there's an attractor within entrepreneurs and business people where they're really oftentimes trying to improve cognitive and physical performance to be more effective at work. And if you play around at all with the dietary options out there, like you could go from paleo to vegan to ketotic to, macrobiotic or what have you, about a 1 month trial of each one of those things. And then you look back and you're like, okay, I really get it. I see which one is going to work best for me.
I think that the day that I realized that, this paleo fad is working for me was when I realized that I had control over my weight. My weight didn't control me.
Right.
If the scale started moving in the wrong direction, I could be, you know what? I need to stop and reset. And then 2 weeks later, I was back at the weight that I wanted to be.
Right.
And as a male that had, tinkered with, different things on and off, ones and zeros kind of guy, it was very liberating. And this fat diet led me to my naturopathic school. High risk, high reward, but I believe that this is the way to help the most people in a insurance-free environment, reaching out and trying to help as many people that are sick and they have their innate need to not be sick anymore.
Right. Couldn't agree more.
Rob, thank you so much for the interview. Where can folks find you? Where are you speaking? Any projects you're working on?
I'm working on a project with Diana Rogers focusing on sustainability, and it's a book, and we'll probably sell 3 copies of it, but it's one of those things that just needs to be done, and so we're chipping away at that. I will be at Paleo FX. Bring your gis because they're going to have a jiu-jitsu area there again. That's my main excitement there, but I guess I will be giving a talk on some knuckleheaded topic, and then I will be at so Paleo FX, and then also AHS up in Seattle. I'll be doing my It's Not Your Fault, How You're Wired to Eat talk. And it's a pretty good talk. It's a pretty good horse and pony deal at this point. So I'll be up there as well.
And websites?
RobbWolf.com is where most of my stuff is. And then the main social media platform I'm on these days is Instagram. My handle there is @DasRobbWolf, DasRobbWolf.
Awesome, Rob. You're going to have to hang out with me a lot this year because I'll be at AHS and Paleo FX, so.
Awesome, man. NorCal margaritas are on me.
Oh, man.
I will hook you up.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, and see you soon.
Take care.